can and you do want to, like and subscribe and share.
To get every notification, just ring the black bell. We're going to start a series episode on the Latter-day Saints. I want to quickly read 1 Thessalonians 5:21 through 22. Test everything, hold fast to what is good, and abstain from every form of evil. There's better translations, but it's essentially like, test all things and hold fast to what is good, and abstain from everything that is bad. Because this is the Kali Yuga and all. And with that, I say try a little bit of LDS and figure out what you feel about it, because it's a pretty interesting religion. So with that, a little backstory on Joseph Smith. He was born in 1805. He was charismatic. He was an esotericist with the Jupiter talisman in his pocket when he died. He was a dowser, like his father, who was a well witcher, which is what another word for dowsing is. And if you don't know much about dowsing, it's a way of finding wells by finding water underneath the earth. And it works. I mean, I have seen it work. My grandfather was a well dowser successfully, amongst other things, like he was an engineer also. So perhaps you have to believe. Anyway, he was a good boy, this Joseph Smith, and he was trying to find out from God directly how to be the best and which way was the right way. And God said to start his own fellowship, so he did. Eventually, it led to a religion with a plural marriage system, which led to a lot of controversy about the church itself. I don't really see this as a big controversy. I'm surprised it is, considering, And essentially, he had an alpha wife, and he had a system. And after the Mormon Wars, there was a lot of widows. So, because there had been a genocide campaign, an extermination, at least, of the Latter-day Saints from Missouri. And a brutal war that just killed so many people, women and children even. I've heard quotes that the boys and girls 5 to 10 years old begged not to be shot, and they were told that lice breeds rats, something to that effect. So Brigham Young, after Joseph Smith, led with the Missouri Wars behind him, and created with Joseph Smith, after the fall of Joseph Smith, this epic religion. And it makes a lot of sense. Also, progenitors would, like Charles Dawkins, who, a broken clock is right twice a day sometimes, unless it's spinning randomly, in which case it could be wrong all the time. The point is, Richard Dawkins, he did say that there is a selfish gene, and it's the idea that genes would like to exterminate all the other genes. And essentially, his religion talked about this prophet from this ancient culture that spanned the world, and the Mormons were trying to create this heaven where they were actually more than just on death to you part, you become your own existence. And it's a fascinating concept, because it gets into this idea of Mormon transhumanism and becoming more than just a person, but becoming an entire type of civilization with beings underneath you. So Latter-day Futurism is an interesting subject, and there's actually a field of it if you're interested in Latter-day Saint transhumanism, Mormon transhumanism. Yeah, I'll skip that part. But really, it's about creating this heaven on earth, because you imagine that you've created a society where everything is perfect, and you try to convert them. You say, oh, well, when you die, you'll go to heaven and be with God. And they say, well, we already live forever, and we don't understand what's the difference between heaven and a place where we have no sickness or hunger and everything's happy all the time. And who is this God, and how is it more powerful and more knowledgeable and wise than we are? And this is this next level civilization religion that's slightly more interesting than the way it's been presented, and I think that deserves a little bit of credit. So also, he got what he wanted, and it turned into this crazy thing, and it wasn't so great to have 99 wives, because a lot of them turned out to be of other men, or the men were just in general angry and jealous for not having them themselves, so they martyred or murdered Joseph Smith in a fashion that made him more famous and made it impossible for him to do anything bad ever again. So it only allowed you a legacy of positivity for the most part, and then hearsay. So this is an interesting time to find out that Joseph Smith is not, they're telling you often he's a drunk, angry, fat, ugly man. So here's his death mask, right? And you get an idea that they didn't really lie about his pictures. He was, a rather handsome, man. Interesting also, right? So 15 years earlier, before he died, he had been reading out of a hat, and I think you've probably seen the South Park, but there's more to it than that. It's an interesting story about this Indo-Aryan-American empire that was literate and had medals, and it's interesting that so much of it seems to have been disappeared, but we think it could be just stolen, like it belongs in a museum, Indiana Jones would say. But he also talked about different races in the Americas that had been genocided, raped into extinction, or, the Lamanites, the Jaredites, the Molochites, and the Nephites. It's a very interesting correlation with Alexandrian Coptic stories about Tartaria, and the mobile cities are mentioned in the Jaredites or the Molochites. They have the flags. This is from a Mormon book about the Jaredites too. It's like Genghis Khan's, hordes in Europe. Mormon scholars have gone deep into this. And we talked last time a bit about megafloods and wars and the idea of these storm wars that existed in the 19th century or before that are photographed and documented as floods and droughts and dust storms throughout the 19th century, including this picture of Sacramento that, as far as the eye can see, is both water and cities, which is an interesting aside. Plus the electric systems. And you find that these megastorms were not freak events, but repeated about every 200 years. Although, coincidentally, I tend to think that those are the same events, and we'll get into more about why later. But the sedimentation that has resulted was documented, and geologists in California, will tell you about the mega floods and the mud floods. So here's a picture of simultaneously the drought happening to the flood, and within the same year or two, you see a difference in the clearing out. And also, there was a Mormon island in the 1830s that's been buried under a lake in California because of a dam, and it was very vibrant. There was a bridge. It's been uncovered recently, more or less, and you can see the quality of the stonemasonry is almost Peruvian again, and Gothic, Visigothic, and alludes to this Tartarian concept. And here's another example of a submerged ghost city. And here's another example of a submerged ghost city. And you'll find these around South America, here in the world, but here's one in Venezuela, in Potosi, where they built a dam in order to essentially hide this church. They had electricity, of course. South America gets most of its electricity from the Paraguayan dam, but iconoclasm, communist era, right? So we've got the building kind of wiped out, and interestingly enough, it survived, and when it resurfaced, it was still the last thing that lasted, so they tried to blow it up. Seriously, they tried to blow it up with dynamite. This is what's left of it. That should provoke you as well. And there's lots of other churches that are, you can look up ghost water churches, underwater churches, submerged cathedrals, and you'll see that they're everywhere. Canada has full cities. This is like in Europe. I think this is in Venice. I forget. Near Venice is an island called Proviglia, and it was clearly a star fort, and it has arches and architecture, but it was used for the plague and to house and then an insane asylum. So I believe it was a biochemical warfare laboratory at some point, or perhaps it was a medical institution for studying, and things went out of control. But it became a very creepy place for for the next few centuries. And again, look at the architecture, the arches, and the proportions of the ones above and below. So for the golden ratio. Another island that you should look for, because where in the world is Isla Bermea? It's supposed to be in the Gulf of Mexico. I've heard theories that people say it was made up as a tourist attraction, but I think that that's pretty absurd. It's more likely that the official story from British maps and from Humboldt sailors showed that it disappeared underwater. Either it sank or the water levels rose, and there's a lot of evidence for water levels and land levels rising. So here's a picture of these dust storms that I think we now know were bigger and longer and not just, we're explained about this dust bowl that happened and people driving with these fancy vehicles that cost $500 across the country to just populate this new world. And you got to wonder about that. Like the Ford vehicles were insanely cheap, and then they just poured out into the streets with them. So who amongst us can remember what really happened? It gets back to, we constantly are asking about how truth is lies, because everyone's lying to some extent. I mean, people will tell you they've seen this stuff, and who are you going to believe, Because basically your options come down to tall tales, and that's about it. And tall tales are interesting in and of itself. If you start looking into the American tall tales, a lot of them come from the 18th, 19th century. You have stories like Pecos Bill, who sends his wife to the moon, and he rides a dust devil, or a vortex, a tornado through the plains. And David Crockett, who was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, predominantly of French Huguenot ancestry. And that gets into the Irish Porter connection because of the porters from Ireland who came bringing the French Huguenots after allied with the British in the war. But Davy Crockett, for all of his eccentric stories, was a real man. David Crockett was a senator. He was considered an amazing hero until he became renowned for his stories. And then he called him a drunk, and they said he was just making up all these fantastic stories, and that there's no way these stories happened during the 19th century, such as there's one that he went to the North Pole because there was a mini ice age, and he restarted the Earth, which had slowed down its spinning from the inside. And he starts the Earth spinning again and heats up, and the Earth begins to rotate again. So you have tall tales, or then you have these sobered surveyors, whom you have to trust slightly more, I suppose, than are drunkards. But who are these surveyors? They're the Latter-day Saints, who don't drink, of course, and they're, very hard workers. And they were a godsend, let's say, during the Spanish-American War and in the Civil War. And the U.S. Mormon Battalion March is an infamous long route that was taken as the Mormons went across all of these regions that cover essentially what modern-day mud-flooded areas are, where you can see California's sand, long desert cover. Why would you walk through that desert? And up through the rings, into the lakes, into Mount Zion and around Utah, finding the center of America. And this is the Mormon Capital Battalion Monument in Salt Lake City. And you can see these Sumerian-like stoneworks in front of this Athenian neoclassical Palladio-inspired building that is of Tartarian ancestry. And here's a tunnel under the Mormon churches. There was a sort of golden dragon hidden in here. So there are tunnels underneath the Mormon temples that lead to places, of course. And also, the Mormon genealogy archives are built into tunnels into the sides of mountains. They're military-like fortifications, is the best way to put that. And the Mormon genealogy archives are very important because they baptize in the name of all those who have fallen without the opportunity of knowing the religion and baptizing themselves. So they keep very dense records, and in fact, we're on Ancestry.com. And this is where they keep their archives, in these military-like bunkers embedded into the sides of stone mountains. So it's sort of a fantastic story about this group of people that were supposedly the sobered witnesses, and their belief in something that's so much of a tall tale. But is it really? Because there's plenty of evidence of the pale Native American tribes, and the idea is less and less disturbing of Indo-Aryan relations with Scythians in South America and North America. So is it possible that in 1823, when Joseph Smith discovered these golden plates, that they were real? And Joseph Smith preached to the Indians, and many Indians became Latter-day Saints as well, which was very interesting. And that gets into the Cherokee Confederate Alliance, because he shows the 5 civilized tribes in a sort of negative light at the end of the Book of Mormon. So the Confederate Alliance, and the Cherokee, by the way, who's very fantastic and supposedly is written by a man named Sequoyah, though he even claimed to have gotten it from natives, were part of the principal 5 tribes, and not principled, by the way, but the leading 5 tribes, and they were the civilized. And civilized is an interesting term, because these Indians were slave traders themselves and kept slaves. And it is notable that there are descendants of these slaves, not only of the Cherokee, who had thousands, also of the other civilized tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Seminoles, and the Creeks, all large slave trade economies, and were the principal slave traders with the which gets into what the Book of Mormon said about the final winners of the South American Wars. So Temescua started the Indigenous Confederacy, or at least created one, which these could have been Soviets that could reform at any time like lodges. Temescua was known for his iconoclasm of Western symbolism. Temescua's Confederacy was an attempt to escape the imperialism of the colonial empire of corporate British, Dutch, East India traders, who had successfully subjugated, replicate their control over North America that they had. And, we're told that the Athenians were our original democratic link, but that's not actually where we get, they were socialist pedophiles. That's not actually where we get democracy and self-determination, which is a more important thing than a dictatorship of the majority oppressing a minority. But we got the Confederacy, the American system of Confederacy came from, and the American system of federal tribalism came from the Confederacy of the Indians. The sacking of Tartary as the United Trade Company's colonial takeover of North America and of South America and of East Asia. So the causes of the War of 1812. Temescua's Confederacy was convinced by the British that it was a wise move to rebel against the United States. And immediately, Temescua and his brother intended to launch a triple threat with the 3 tribes against the British and the French. Temescua created a confederacy against all white settlers, and the British helped to attack these white settlers. So that's an interesting point. And we're told that it's because the British and the French and the Americans all hated each other, so they thought they could use the Indians as cannon fodder. Might be true. There's an example of this in another state, in Paraguay, which the Jesuits had built this fantastic republic, and there's a film called The Mission. It's worth seeing. They essentially took the same strategy as the French-American War and decimated the population from all angles, from Brazil, from Argentina, and Bolivia, and killed 90 to 99% of the population. Very few women and children survived. And it makes sense why they want to dismantle all of these monuments that are in the name of the fallen Confederates, because these are symbols of family and love and people holding each other together. They're not the symbols of hate that we are taught that they are, or we are reacting to, whereas we're reacting for. And I wondered when this started how this could go down, that Southern hospitality would become the next hate crime, because, you know, there was also a religion of peace now. There's no such thing as a civil war. I'm going to call it something else: the uncivil war of Federalist crimes against humanity. And it's normally called the War of Northern Aggression, but I don't think that's quite aggressive enough.
If you can, and you do want to, like and subscribe and share.
Get every notification, just ring the black bell.